Hello and welcome to tonight's edition of Resistance TV. This evening we're going to be talking about the prospects for socialism in the 21st century, and I'm delighted to be joined by a veteran socialist, Dave Nellist, and many people will be familiar with Dave with his work in the Trade Union and Socialist Coalition. But Dave was first elected as the MP, Labour MP, for Coventry South East in 1983, and he represented that seat for 9 years. And when he was first elected, he shared an office, believe it or not, with Tony Blair, but that relationship didn't last too long. You won't be surprised to know. He was voted Backbencher of the Year by the Spectator magazine in the year, I think it was, that he was expelled from the Labour Party, and he stood as an independent in his own constituency and got the support of his constituency Labour Party, actually, which was more than happened to me when I stood as an independent in the last election, and came very, very close to actually retaining his seat. I think the majority that Labour achieved over Dave was something like 1,351, if memory serves me correctly. As I say, Dave helped to found the Trade Union and Socialist Coalition in 2010 and attempted to actually rejoin the Labour Party after Jeremy Corbyn was elected in 2017, but disgracefully was, like so many other people actually, barred from joining the party. The constituency that Dave used to represent is now represented by Zara Sultana, who is a socialist member of the campaign group in the House of Commons. So hopefully a worthy successor to Dave's legacy. But I wanted to just begin because Dave's got a long record of campaigning for socialism through his entire adult life, really. And I just thought it'd be interesting if we could maybe start, Dave, if you could say a little bit about the struggles that you encountered maybe just before, and particularly though when you were first elected in 1983, because at that election we had a fairly socialist, when I say we, the Labour Party, as a member of the Labour Party then as you were, a fairly socialist programme under Michael Foot, and Tony Benn was in his pomp, of course. But regrettably, Tony didn't get elected at that election. I think had he done so, then he would have gone on to become the leader of the Labour Party, and the course of history would have been very different. Unfortunately, Labour members elected Neil Kinnock, who was the midwife to New Labour. So just tell us a little bit, Dave, about your experiences as a Labour MP in those early days. And I guess there was quite a lot of hope that, socialism was on the rise. Certainly from my perspective, I felt it was, after the 1979 defeat, that, with the reforms that Tony Benn was pushing through, that Labour could genuinely become a vehicle to deliver socialism. What do you think?
Well, thanks for inviting me, Chris. Pleased to have this chat with you. Yes, as you say, got first elected in 83 until 92. I actually did another 14 years after that as a socialist councillor in Coventry, because although the defeat took place, as you've mentioned, the thin Labour majority of just over 1,000, there was still sufficient of a socialist presence in Coventry to sustain independent socialist councillors. There was 3 of us on there for quite a number of years. And just to complete the story, you're right, the Labour whips thought it was a bit of a joke to put the 2 youngest Labour MPs in the same office together, which turned out to be me and Tony Blair. We lasted about 4 weeks, and then he went off and found a better office with a stone fireplace and so on with Gordon Brown. And from there, New Labour was born. So if you want anybody to blame for pushing him in the direction of Gordon Brown, I suppose I get it. There was a left manifesto. There was loads of things in terms of public ownership, of restoring the balance for working people that was to be supported. In the years after the war, we'd had a period up to the mid-70s when I joined the Labour Party in the 74 elections, where working people could look forward to a better year. I can remember my dad saying, his aspiration for his 3 children was that they had a better life than he did. And that was a generation in the 50s and 60s where one skilled working class wage could buy you a house, a couple of weeks holiday, and bring up a family. I don't know any working class families now that can do that, in some cases on 2 wages. So there was the aspiration of life improving, which had been shaken in the 70s and the early 80s economically, and then with the election of Margaret Thatcher in 79. And although Labour had a left-wing manifesto, the vote was split by the right-wing split off of the SDP. They got about 7.5 million votes to Labour's 8.5, if I remember rightly. So Thatcher had a big majority. And some of the battles then moved on to industrial playing, particularly obviously the miners in 84 to 85. And I think the first thing that, in a sense, contrasts between that period and now is I think that the left in Parliament were more coherent. I think they were stronger. I mean, numerically, we got up to about 38, 39. So it might have been a roughly similar number to those today. I think we're physically stronger. I mean, I can remember in the middle of the miners' strike, Eric Heffer leading us. I think I was second in the line, but 30 of us invaded the pitch in between the two halves of the Commons when Norman Fowler, the Tory Secretary of State for Social Security, was cutting the benefits of the partners and children of striking miners by £18 a week in order to try and force the miners back to work. And we took our opposition not just in speeches but in disrupting Parliament, and then went out on campaigns explaining why we were doing that and using Parliament as a platform, as a bridge into the campaigns and so on. So I think we had a strong presence then. But as you say, the election of Neil Kinnock and his betrayal both of the miners and of the local authority struggles, particularly Liverpool and Lambeth, meant that he was preparing the ground for what came in the 90s, which was the overt right-wing leadership of Tony Blair, who by that time was heading for leading the Labour Party. So I look back on it, in terms of the struggles we were involved in on minimum wages, on unemployment, redundancies, defence against privatisation and those things. Happy I was able to play a role, but sad that we lost some of those battles because they became the basis on which further problems arose.
Do you feel that members of Parliament on the left had a stronger connection with grassroots? I'm just thinking really in terms of the witch hunt that we're encountering still now in the Labour Party, particularly intense. It's calmed down a bit, but it is still ongoing. But it was particularly intense when Jeremy was the leader, and I was one of the victims of the witch hunt. But there are many, many others as well. I mean, hundreds, thousands of grassroots members, some high-profile individuals, including people like Ken Livingstone, Jackie Walker, Tony Kingston, Cyril Chilson, many of whom are Jewish. And I was the only MP, but not a single other member of the Socialist Campaign Group raised their head above the parapet to speak out against the witch hunt and in support for those people who are being despicably targeted, really, and accused effectively of being bigots and racists. And I was literally the only one who was prepared to stand in solidarity. How did that contrast? Because you were a victim of a different type of witch hunt, and there were many others who fell victim to that in the 1980s. I remember Eric Heffer walking out of the Labour Party conference in 1985, and I was at that conference, and again, it was a disgraceful spectacle that Kinnock indulged in then, and some of his his cohorts, etc., Blunkett and the rest of them. And I just wondered, what level of solidarity did you encounter compared to the Socialist Campaign Group of today?
Well, there's two answers. Firstly, there's the personal and the more general. My own expulsion was not an internal one in Coventry. There wasn't a single affiliated organisation in Coventry which called for my expulsion. In fact, there were only 3 individual members of a Labour Party of many, many hundreds strong who made statements to the investigative procedures that Labour Party put in place in the middle of 1991 to support my expulsion. And within, I think, about 3 years of my expulsion taking place, 2 of those 3 were financially contributing to my campaigns to be an independent socialist councillor in Coventry. So there wasn't a basis in Coventry. My expulsion in particular, and on a wider basis at that point of 89 to 91, was very much tied up with Labour's move to the right and preparation for the 92 election. And Neil Kinnock not dissimilar to Keir Starmer at the moment, trying to prove that Labour could be a safe pair of hands for the establishment if it were given the chance to come back into office. And it particularly revolved around the poll tax. Poll tax brought in 1989 in Scotland, 1990 in England. There were about 30 of us in the campaign group initially pledged not to pay the poll tax. Only one went the whole distance. That's the late Terry Fields from Liverpool Broadgreen, who served 58 days in Walton prison for refusing to pay the poll tax. And I was next. I mean, I'd made statements at that time in the summer of 91 that in order to stop a single pensioner from my patch going to Durham Maximum Security Prison for 3 months, they could take me first. And that's when Roy Hattersley moved the motion at the National Executive Committee in the late summer of 91 for Terry's expulsion. And it was amended by Claire Short to add my name. So the two of us were then moved forward for expulsion. Now, there's just two other facts from that. Firstly, particularly for younger viewers, that was the biggest civil disobedience campaign of the 20th century.
The poll tax campaign.
If I was to tell you that in the run-up to April 1990, the average number of cases that went through the magistrates' courts in England and Wales was 2 million a year. That was anything up to a 6-month custodial sentence, but it could be things like not having paid a TV license, as well as minor theft and stuff like 2 million a year. Between April 1990 and September 1993, the number of cases that went through the magistrates' courts on top of that 2 million a year for refusal or inability to pay the poll tax was 25,016,263. It's not only burned on my brain, I've actually got the documents that the House of Commons Library prepared me all along the way, confirming the figures from the Home Office. And that's what sank Thatcher. So that bottom-up campaign of civil disobedience of millions of ordinary working people was able to shift the Prime Minister with a bigger majority than Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson's no Margaret Thatcher, by the way, but it was able to do that. And instead of Labour riding that to victory and supporting it, they expelled dozens, perhaps hundreds in that couple of year period of people associated with the poll tax. And whilst they had, in April 1990, 4 days after the so-called riots of Trafalgar Square, where the whole coverage for a week of the media was how unruly and riotous the anti-poll tax people were. Despite that, at the end of that week, Labour had a 26-point lead in the opinion polls, and yet Kinnock managed to lose that election because he showed a split Labour Party and he was more concerned with attacking the left than attacking the Tories. So that was my experience of expulsion and the general political main issue at the time, which was the poll tax. What I think has been the lesson of the last couple of years is that Jed, who, I went into Parliament with in 83 and did a lot of work with in the 80s and consider, let's not make it past tense, consider a friend, was successful in making the Labour Party more radical and having a radical manifesto. And in the summer of 2017, it was the biggest rise in Labour votes since Attlee at the end of the Second World War. 3.5 million people. And by the way, the extra 3.5 million votes that Jed got in 2017, 1 million come from ex-UKIP voters, which just makes the point. You don't have to wrap yourself in the Union Jack to appeal to the class instincts of people who might have voted for a right-wing party in the past. But the next 2 years was all about the destabilisation of the Labour Party from internally. And we know the 851-page document that got leaked last year, which detailed the vicious way in which paid officials were dealing with the internal life of the Labour Party, trying to make sure that Jed lost that election in December 2019. And of course, the overwhelming attacks by the media and others to make the question of anti-Semitism that which it was. And I agree with you, by the way, if I'm not paraphrasing you incorrectly, I think the Labour Party was too far on the back foot in dealing with that issue right at the very beginning and allowing it to fester. So in that sense, by not being as resolute as he should have been, Jeremy allowed the conditions to be created where the defining issue wasn't the radical socialism of 2017, it was the response or lack of response to the accusations of anti-Semitism. And then the individuals all get caught up in that along the way. So I do think there were differences in the way in which those witch hunts were generated on both those periods.
Indeed, there were, absolutely differences. But the point I was asking about, though, Dave, was just in terms of the level of solidarity from members of parliament who were on the left. I mean, did you get supportive, statements or, representations made by members of Labour members of parliament, or were you left on your own?
Up until I was actually found guilty by the National Constitutional Committee, I think December 1991, and then formally expelled at the NEC in January 1992. Up until the actual decision of the National Constitutional Committee, I had quite a number of campaign group members. We held, for example, in the month before the final hearings of the National Constitutional Committee in Coventry, in just the one constituency. There were then 4 constituencies in Coventry. Mine was just one of them. In that Coventry South East constituency, we held 10 public meetings 3 days apart. In each section of a ward, there were 4 wards in the constituency, so we had 2 or 3 meetings, on this estate or that estate and so on. And at each one of them, there was a campaign group member speaking. Bob Cryer, Harry Cohen, Jeremy, Dennis Skinner, the members. Then we had a couple of campaign group members who initially said yes and then pulled out just before the meetings. But we managed 10 meetings in 30 days, and they all had 50 or 60 people at each one of them. So the total attendance was several hundred people in the constituency, heard from the campaign group MP why the real reason for the witch hunt was one of making the Labour Party look safe for the establishment. I would add, by the way, that once the decision was taken to begin that expulsion procedure in, I think it was August of 2019, the day afterwards, the Evening Standard had a double-page spread with the photo of every campaign group member saying to Kinnock, now you've started on these 2, here's the next 35 you should be going after. Making the point, as far as the establishment were concerned, it wasn't the individual crimes, peccadillos, what have you, of an individual. They wanted the left of the Labour Party exercising so that the next government that came in was going to be a safer pair of hands for the establishment.
Yeah. What I find really regrettable about all this is that, people on the left in Parliament don't seem to have learned from the light of experience, of that experience, of indeed, years of the more recent witch hunt, and the failure to confront them and stand up for the reputation of the party. Jeremy's own reputation ultimately led to his own demise. And now, of course, it's spread beyond the Labour Party. And whilst it's calmed down a wee bit in the party, we don't hear so much about it now. They're now going after academics like Dave Miller. And, this is a very worrying trend and a pernicious trend that we absolutely have to do everything we can to resist. But I think you can trace it back to that failure inside the Labour Party to actually confront it and to resist and stand up for the party's own reputation. I mean, it's ironic that some of the strongest anti-racist campaigners have been labelled racists themselves, and it's it's a shocking state of affairs. But just in terms,
I just think that one of the points to make there is that, you say about it going a little bit quieter. Regretfully, what we've got to also recognise is the level of disillusionment amongst a lot of the activists in the Labour Party. Between April, I think it was the 4th last year, when Keir Starmer was announced as leader, through to the National Executive Committee elections in November, 57,000 people resigned their membership from the Labour Party. And I think if you add in the ones who have not rejoined and paid this year's subs, it's probably double that number now. So one of the things, and it's part of our joint work in Tusk, I think you would agree, is we've got to find a home for those people who were inspired by Jeremy, are disillusioned by Keir Starmer, and don't just drop out of political activity. They're too important a political resource. I'm not being pejorative here, but they're too important a political resource just to let fade away. We've got to find a structure and a means by which those people are kept into activity. And it's not just us that should do that. I mean, just think of this little scenario. If on that day in October, when Jeremy was reinstated by the National Executive Committee, and remember, by the way, when he was suspended by the National Executive Committee, regretfully only 18 Labour MPs signed a letter of opposition to his suspension. Admittedly, 28 signed a letter welcoming him back in October, but then Keir Starmer immediately suspended from the Parliamentary Labour Party. What sort of impact would it have had if, metaphorically, if not for pandemic reasons, literally, the whole campaign group had gone and sat around Jeremy on the benches of the House of Commons and said, if you're coming for him, you're coming for us as well, and put a declaration of war down. Now, that would have been comparable to what a year earlier Boris Johnson had done to 21 former cabinet ministers, chancellors, secretary of states who didn't agree with his direction of Brexit, so he sacked them as Tory MPs. If the Socialist campaign group had stood with Jeremy at that particular point in that way, they could have re-inspired thousands of those people who subsequently left Labour Party. Not only that there was a fight on, but it was one worth getting involved in.
Oh, yes. I mean, Boris Johnson gave a masterclass, actually. I mean, Jeremy should have done a bit of that and, dealt with his malcontents in that way. I was urging that. And certainly there should have been solidarity from the Socialist campaign group. I wasn't surprised because there was literally none for me. No public solidarity. There were a handful, and it was literally a handful who offered private words of condolence to me, but nobody was prepared to put their head above the parapet, as I was saying earlier. But what I'm just going to go on, though, to say is just in terms of, the prospects for socialism in the 21st century, we had that period of Tony Benn leading those reforms inside the Labour Party. Even the PLP at that time elected a relatively left-wing leader in the form of Michael Foot. We had a leftish manifesto in 1983, the year that you were elected, and it dissipated. We saw what happened with the SDP, and then the arrival of Neil Kinnock and the party drifting to the right, and then we've seen Jeremy and what's happened to him. I guess the two questions really. One, is the Labour Party ever likely to be a vehicle to deliver progressive socialism in this country? And if it isn't, what are the prospects of actually building a genuine socialist alternative outside of the Labour Party, do you think?
No, well, like you, I think we need a new vehicle. I think the election of Keir Starmer, the overt move to the right on policies, particularly the question of being friendly to business, which covers a multitude of sins, not least the question of his attitude to corporation tax rise. He's in danger this week of being outflanked on the left by a right-wing Tory chancellor. So the policies are moving, and of course, when the election took place 18 months ago, his candidacy was on continuity of Corbyn policies, but there were probably not just those of us watching here tonight who thought that was not a likely position. But so the policies are moving to the right. In fact, the nearest it gets to criticism in recent months in the House of Commons at Prime Minister's question time is to say to Boris Johnson, I agree with the Prime Minister, but you should have done that 3 weeks ago. And it's the timing issue rather than the substance. So, for example, there's no serious challenge from Labour for 100% of wages, not 80% and about to be less of a furlough scheme. Let's resurrect the 1930s flags of work or full pay, which ought to have been Labour's demands. There's been no sustained campaign from the Labour front bench on the question of re-nationalisation of the NHS, of putting track, trace, isolate and support into public health local hands, of taking the Sercos and Capitas of this world out of the scheme of things when it comes to the pandemic. And then there's the structural issues. The National Executive Committee now is supportive of Keir Starmer. The officials, such as the General Secretary, is a former Assistant General Secretary under Tony Blair, so we can tell where his loyalties lie. Unfortunately, and this is a criticism of Jeremy and John, that they didn't give the same organisational changes during the 4.5 years they were in charge as they did in the radical political ideas they raised. So the vast majority of the Parliamentary Labour Party remains as it was, as is the same for local councillors up and down the country. So actually to have a challenge for Labour leadership now, as I understand it, requires 40 Labour MPs. Even if there was a vacancy, and that normally only comes after a lost general election, so we could be talking about another 3.5 years away. Even if there was a vacancy, of the 18 who were prepared to support Jeremy when he was being suspended, if that's the bottom line of the serious left in the Parliamentary Labour Party, it doesn't look like they'll get a nomination on the ballot paper this time round. And then there's the hemorrhaging of members, as I say, probably around the 100,000 mark. So politically and structurally, at the very least for the short term, and it is arguable for the longer term as well, I wouldn't be spending my time in the Labour Party. I think the extent to which even good activists at the most senior level in the Labour Party can operate these days is they're in a prison, which Keir Starmer has constructed, and occasionally they'll be able to put a note through the bars saying there's still a couple of socialists in here, but in terms of fundamentally working on the struggles of the day, the vast majority of them won't be, and that's where we need to build. We need to be building in and in support of all those affected by fire and rehire at the moment. The Heartlands Hospital porters, the Manchester bus workers, British Gas, even scandalously 4,000 council workers in Labour Tower Hamlets. It always pains me to raise that one, because 100 years ago today, if you wanted a Liverpool of 100 years ago, it was the Poplar Council in London that stood up against the Liberal Tory coalition of the day on the question of local council services, and were prepared to go to prison and run their council from their jail cells, led by George Lansbury, who later in the 1930s became the leader of the Labour Party. And today, I don't see a single Labour council that's emulating Poplar or Claycross or Liverpool or Lambeth. And if we don't have the structure that allows debate and democracy in the Labour Party, and you've instanced many of those who have been expelled and marginalised at the moment, if the trade unions themselves have been reduced, on financial terms, their contribution to Labour now is about 10% of the Labour budget. So when My Union Unite reduces its support by 10%, or the CWU and the fire brigades threaten the same, it doesn't have a financial impact, and they don't have the same structures in conferences and democratic decision making for their delegates to make a difference inside the Labour Party, which is probably why the Bakers Union just concluded a survey of all its members about whether it should continue affiliating to the Labour Party. And I think, if I understand correctly, only 9% of the respondents thought Labour was doing a good job for union members. So the structures aren't there, the policies aren't there. The inspiration that Jeremy gave on policy is not there for union members. And we've got such big battles coming up. Council tax going up by 5%, continuation of austerity with 250,000 local councils jobs lost in the last 10 years. So that means libraries and community centres and nurseries and youth clubs. We need to fight not only to maintain the ones we've got, but particularly in the time of a pandemic, when today I think the total spend by the Tory government is now projected to exceed £400 billion. There's no question that there isn't money available for public services. Where is the strong political campaigns for those services to be improved and enhanced. And I think we've got to start from something new. Now, in a sense, I'm saying that by being part of a relaunch of something that's 11 years old. But Bob Crow held a couple of conferences in 2009. One at the beginning of the year, one at the end. I had to speak at both of them on behalf of the Socialist Party. And at the first one, John McDonnell spoke on behalf of the Labour left. And at the last one, Jeremy Corbyn spoke on behalf of the Labour left. And the debate, Bob said, is there's a crisis in political representation for working people. What are we going to do about it? And the conclusion that Bob and the RMT drew, the Transport Union, the Rail Union, the RMT, was to launch Tusk in January 2010 to give trade unionists, community campaigners and socialists a common vehicle with a set of core common policies that we could stand at elections against the austerity that was running apace from the 2008-2009 recession. Now, we got to the point in 2015 where we were the sixth biggest party in the country. As Michael Caine would have said, not a lot of people know that, because we managed, I think, 2 interviews with Andrew Neil in that year and 1 5-minute party political broadcast. But we stood 135 parliamentary candidates and 619 council candidates. And then, of course, a few months later, Jeremy got elected as leader of the Labour Party. And we recalibrated and said, look, there is a possibility now that socialism and support for socialism can grow inside Labour when you've got a leader like Jeremy. Let's give it a chance. So we didn't stand in the elections, general elections of 2017 or 2019. But Jeremy, having been deposed, Keir Starmer being elected, all the other points that I made, I won't repeat, is a new era. The Corbyn era is over. And we have to come to terms with that. And that's why we have relaunched and are hoping to stand in dozens and dozens and dozens of towns, cities and counties in the elections on May the 6th, for the Welsh Synod, for the Scottish Parliament, and try at least put an initial point, a marker down for anti-austerity and pro-socialist alternative. Now, we're not overly prescriptive about this. We've got just 8 points on our website that were endorsed at a meeting that Chris and I were both at a couple of weeks or 10 days or so ago, no, 2 weeks ago, which are the core things like opposition to austerity, opposition to privatisation, bringing things back in-house on councils, public ownership to enable the planning of society's resources to be better made for ordinary working people, opposition to racism and other similar basic things. And then anybody who becomes a candidate, and I hope if you're watching tonight and you're interested, you'll look on the Tusk website, tusk.org.uk, where all the materials there to decide if you'd like to become a candidate, application forms, the policies, and so on. We don't then stop any organisation, such as Resist or the Socialist Party or anyone else who's affiliated or an individual member of Tusk, from adding on to that core policy the things that they feel ought to be raised in front of working people, either locally about a swimming pool and a library, what have you, or more generally about their view of socialism. And I think that's the initial step that we can make, is bringing people together, core platform that includes people, doesn't exclude people, and starting off with these elections May the 6th. I'll just make one last point, because I realise it's been a long answer. But the thing that would be a game changer today was if we had another Bob Crow. If, as in 2009, Bob brought together a few hundred leading trade union and socialist activists in the Friends Meeting House in London on a couple of occasions to debate this issue, the left-led unions, about half a dozen of them, you'd say, were the left-led unions, were to call a conference and invite socialists inside and outside the Labour Party to participate in debating how should we move forward. I think that would literally be a game changer. Tusk isn't precious. We don't think, arithmetically, we're going to grow on a one-by-one basis to become the replacement of the Labour Party in the next few months or next few years. That's a job for the mass organisations like the trade unions to come to grips with. But along the way, we can be an organisation that is a catalyst, that raises the argument, that challenges where battles are taking place, whilst all at the same time saying The unions have to get to grips with the fact they've lost their political voice and have to build a new one.
Yeah, I mean, we've got a number of people who are still in the Labour Party who have joined the Resist movement for a People's Party. Of course, we're not a political party yet. I think, I mean, I'd love to see the sort of conference that you're talking about there, Dave. I doubt it will happen. Well, no, let's put it another way. I doubt that we would get senior Labour Party figures participating, because I think they would be fearful that they would be suspended from the party if they did. But frankly, they should, because in my view, the Labour Party, there's no future for the Labour Party. But I just want to move on a bit, just in terms of the main theme of our conversation tonight about the prospects for socialism in the 21st century. Looking at opinion polls, it seems there's a lot of support for socialist ideas in Britain, across Europe, really. But it seems, notwithstanding hopefully it isn't an aberration with the Jeremy Corbyn era, socialism has been on the retreat in this country and across Europe, certainly social democracy anyway. We saw Syriza in Greece and Camus in Spain making a bit of a difference in terms of changing that sort of course of that trajectory. But in Latin America, socialists seem to be making a lot more progress. I mean, Bolivia, the most notable example recently, but there are others. Do you think there are lessons that we can learn from the movement towards socialism, for example, in Bolivia, that we could maybe apply in this country?
Yes and no. I think the determination and the building up of strong communities and other similar points are obviously things we can learn from, even though I might have 101 disagreements with the trajectory, particularly in the last few decades of Cuba. You can't get away from the fact that if you have an alternative to overt neoliberal capitalism, there's all sorts of things you can do. I mean, 95% of the world's in recession at the moment. The one bit that isn't is China. Now, I've got, again, loads of criticisms with human rights and the lack of democracy in China. But if you have state control of investment, of industry, of the health services and so on, you can turn things around in a way that not only very few people have died in China, but it's the one economy in the world which has gone through a relatively sharp V shape and out the other side, whilst Britain, in the last 12 months has had the worst economic downfall for 300 years. So there are things that can learn, but then of course there are differences in terms of the proportion of the population that you would call working class, industrial working class, unionised and so on. There are different types of struggles that take place, which is why in the British context, I restate the point I made a few minutes ago, that I think if we're going to get a new political voice for working people, it has to be rooted in the organisations and the communities of the working class, and we can't sidestep the role of the trade union movement. It's why I hope we're successful in the next year or two of building Tusk supporters groups in all those affiliated unions, if at the very least to give some support to senior figures who might think, as you say, might be worried about making statements of support. By the way, I must put down on the record that the latest person that's joined us on the Tusk Steering Committee is the current president of USDAW, Amy Murphy, who, USDAW is the fourth largest affiliate to the Labour Party. Amy isn't a Labour Party member, which is how she won't face the problem that you're raising. But we're starting to get that support from the trade union movement and candidates coming forward from a national level in Unison, in the Bakers Union and others. Candidates have been approved in recent days. So apologies if it's a bit of a waffly answer. I take inspiration from a lot of the challenges to neoliberalism, which in the case of Latin America has gone literally hand in glove with the bloody military for many of the decades during which those fights have taken place. But we also have to learn the lessons, I think, particularly in the case, for example, of Chile in the 1970s, is if once you start a serious battle of taking on powerful capitalist forces in a country, you have to be prepared to go the whole way. Otherwise, to use an old aphorism, weakness invites aggression. In the case of Chile, taking a quarter or a third of the economy into public ownership, and with all the radical policies that President Allende put forward, it still left the majority of the economy in private hands that was able to sabotage the workings of the economy and then work hand in glove with the CIA and the Americans to brutally murder thousands of those activists. And we have seen in other Latin American countries, when there's been a swing over from a progressive period to a darker period, how many thousands of lives have lost. So I take inspiration, and we all have to try and learn the lessons of what works well and where there are problems. In our case, we're in a different economic period in Europe and in Britain. We've seen right-wing populism, the Farage and the Trumps and so on, but they don't have, at least in British terms, longer conversation in one or two European countries and in America, but they don't have significant roots within in society. Farage is not, a 1930s style right-wing populist moving over to be a fascist leader. We still have strong trade unions. It's not that we don't have the instruments for change. It's that we don't have people necessarily confident to use the power that exists in those organisations to make the change. And that's a couple of points I would draw from that.
No, indeed. And of course, what did Richard Nixon say about Cuba? He said, we're going to make the economy scream. And those sort of tactics have been applied to Venezuela and other Latin American, and indeed not just Latin America, but other countries around the world. But one of the other things one of the lessons I think we ought to take, and what they've been very successful in Latin America at doing, is uniting the left. I mean, in Venezuela, and in Bolivia and other Latin American countries, they brought the left groupings together. Now that's been our failing, hasn't it? I mean, okay, we have the Labour Party, the broad church, but the left outside the Labour Party has never seemed to be able to kind of work together effectively enough to mount an effective challenge. Do you think that's something now, given the experience of what we've seen with Jeremy Corbyn and, the left did, we thought, gain control of the party, although we didn't, but we got the leadership and we had a left manifesto and all the rest of it. I think, a lot of people thought that the job was done, and it turns out that the left never controlled the Labour Party, even when Jeremy was the leader. Do you think now, having had that salutary experience, that there's more prospect of bringing the left together outside the Labour Party and enticing those who are still in the Labour Party to join us in a genuine left socialist project to offer a real challenge to the neoliberal status quo, which both of the mainstream political parties have signed up to?
There have been a number of attempts. You're right. I was probably most closely associated with the one in the late 1990s, the Socialist Alliance, which just for a little bit of history, built up to active groups in probably 2 or 3 dozen towns and cities by 2001-ish, but actually started in 1992 in Coventry. Not only was I expelled, but my neighbour John Hughes was also prevented from standing again as a Labour MP. And as part of the expulsions, part of my expulsion, 127 people were expelled from the Labour Party in the 2 constituencies. And they got together to form a Socialist Alliance to keep going. And then it spread, and particularly obviously when Tony Blair became leader in the mid-90s, it spread more. But the Socialist Alliance, that was, as I say, an early attempt in the modern era. Left unity, respect, there's been other projects. And I think one of the things is that it's almost been the wrong way round. It's been, let's have unity and we'll talk about what we're going to do with it later. In other words, we'll talk about what the programme and the aims are after we've got unity. And that starts off with people not on a common same bit of paper. The thing about Tusk is that we've started off and have maintained all the way through our lecture with for some people, a relatively limited agenda of 8 points. And we've tried not to go beyond that 8 points, at least in England. unfortunately, I have to report that if you look at the manifestos for Scotland and Wales, they've added 1 or 2 on in their own local jurisdictions. But anyway, in England, we have the 8 points. And if you can establish a bit of unity on the things that you all demonstrably agree with, and then if you have a structure that allows debate and discussion without splits on the bits that you don't agree with, in better times it would be perhaps over a pint down the pub rather than in a splitting meeting, then I think you're on stronger ground. So we have the common basic core agenda that we stand in elections on. We have a federal structure so that affiliated organisations are represented on a national steering committee, and then with consensus we invite leading trade union figures, and in the past there's been some Labour or ex-Labour rather councillors who've been re-elected as independents and so on have sat on the steering committee. And then we have a structure for individual members who are not parts of either Resist or the Socialist Party, who have their own representative on the steering committee. And each one of those has a veto. In other words, consensus is so baked into the structure of Tusk that we cannot go further than we can take everybody on. Now, inevitably, that makes it slower because you're working, and this is no disrespect to anybody, but you're working at the pace of the slowest mover on your speed for socialism and so on. But I think it's held us better together in that last decade, and hopefully will do in the future. But we have to get more than the RMT affiliated at the trade union.
Just before I bring in Sean, though, we're
sure.
Time now. Do you think that experience within the Labour Party will make it easier now to build an alternative, or is it just going to be as difficult? What's your thoughts on that? And then we'll bring in Sean to get our viewers' thoughts on what they heard this evening.
No, for those who've gone through it, hopefully there are lessons which can be drawn, such as, for example, the response which could have been a lot stronger from Jeremy and from John. I think they were more concerned with compromise with other forces in the Labour Party rather than creating an organisational structure that would have matched their aspirations for socialist policies. So if people come out with the idea that we have to build something that's far more robust in fighting for social change, that would be useful. But as I say, our experience is one which I'm quite happy to sell anybody who's interested, is that the federal approach, the core programme, the freedom for discussion, to move at that slightly slower pace, I think is a better way of rebuilding a new left in Britain, but for it to actually wield authority and be seen as viable, it has to be much, much bigger. We have to be talking about probably thousands rather than hundreds of candidates. I think we might be, halfway towards what we did in 2015 over the next few weeks. We have to be a lot bigger than that. And the place where we will build that is in the large communities of the working class and the large organisations of the working class.
Yeah, great. Let's bring in Sean now. Then the last sort of 10 or 12 minutes, get the reaction from our viewers this evening. Over to you, Sean.
Good evening, everyone. Lovely chat this evening. Lots of socialists in the chat from both Tusk and Resist. So it's lovely to meet some Tusk candidates and colleagues as well. Welcome to the channel. Please do subscribe, hit the notification bell and hit that like button so it makes our video more available to people on YouTube. First of all, we're going to go to Mark Anderson. He has a question for Dave, and he says, what does Dave think is the most effective way of fighting back against another round of austerity?
Thanks for your question, Mark. I go with the old slogan, just say no. What we need is a reversal of austerity, and certainly what we need is councillors who will refuse to vote for austerity. I haven't completely got my brain around today's budget before tonight's programme, but the last budget in November, the Tory-led leaders of the Local Government Association estimated out of the 15 billion a year now, they're down on what they were 10 years ago. They needed 8.7 billion from Rishi Sunak to maintain core pandemic related services, core services in the local authorities of the country. They got 2.2 billion. Well, they didn't get 2.2 billion. Rishi Sunak said they could spend 2.2 billion as long as they raised 3/4 of that themselves by putting council tax up by 5%. I've not heard the Labour Party nationally or councillors locally saying that they're not prepared to do that. I think most Labour councils have put it up between 4 and 5%. 30 of the 36 county councils have talked about probable mental health cuts in the next 12 months. Only one of those 36 county councils said they can get through the next financial year without severe cuts. So we urgently need pressure on local authorities from community groups, from local trade unions, and our contribution is through the elections as well. It's fundamental. It's to demand the restoration of the essential funding to local services, which have been stolen by the Tories and by the coalition previously over the last 10 years.
I think that's brings us very nicely onto Catherine's question now. She asks, what is the best approach to force a council cabinet and then government to provide more money to councils for social policies?
There's two answers. It can be local, it can be national. Councils with sustained campaigns against the closure of another library or swimming pool or for essential local services, you can win those battles. There have been, particularly in the health service over hospital closures, there have been some very successful community-led campaigns. And where those are in existence, by the way, I'm in favour of Tusk approaching those community campaigns and saying, can we work together? Would one of your members like to raise in the council chamber the arguments you've been making outside the council chamber about your particular service and so on being better funded and being developed? And I would particularly like to do that if there were elections this year in Tower Hamlets. There aren't in the boroughs of London this year. I'd go to the families of those 4,000 council workers who are having their fire and rehire, their jobs being sacked and rehired on worse terms and conditions, and say there should be a family member in every council seat in Tower Hamlets standing on behalf of the council workforce against these austerity cuts. Nationally, this is a weak government. I mean, it's done, I think, 23, 24 U-turns in the past 18 months. One of the biggest was in April of last year when the government announced a £13.5 billion write-off of historic NHS debt in order to make the balance sheets of trusts up and down the country a little bit more amenable. Now, that's not too far off the 15 billion that local authorities have lost over the last 10 years. If the unions and political forces were allied on the same piece of paper, on the same path, I think they could be running big campaigns to demand that local services be better funded to the extent of restoration of the 10 years that we've lost. But that would need a sea change in the way in which the big unions are operating at the moment.
Yeah, Jonathan Cooper said, Dave, how do you think the left should build supportive media and get the word out about the alternative we're offering while avoiding talking to ourselves?
Oh, well, you're here tonight at one of the examples of how we can do that. If we can develop greater audiences for socialist output and outlets by different parts of social media, then we can raise and reach a wider audience. It doesn't have to be just talking to ourselves. I can't think that, I don't know how many Twitter followers Chris has got at the moment, but I know I think it's into 6 figures. I can't believe everyone is a dyed-in-the-wool socialist. It's something that Chris has said, some criticism he's made, some thing he's supported, some proposal he's made that's chimed with somebody, and they're new in the arena. We need to do that. All of us who've got access to the various arms. I try to do a bit on Twitter and Facebook. I'm still learning about things like Instagram and I haven't done a dance on TikTok yet, but there's time for everything, I suppose. We should be using all those outlets If we were able, then you know, the unions and others should come together and have even more traditional sorts of media. We've tried in the past with newspapers and so on. But I think the key to all these things is that if you have fight and if you have struggle, and then you've got something to report to people, it's worth getting involved in making a change in the world. Then I think they're more likely then to follow, whether it's social media, read a newspaper, come to a meeting, if they think there's a chance of winning. So it all comes back to the basics about building a combative socialist organisation. And in our terms, we're doing it through Tusk and the elections and so on, that can inspire people to get involved. And I think then the media aspect will flow along with that.
Dave, people are quite interested to find out more about Tusk and how many candidates are you planning on standing in the local elections in May? And do you think it will make a difference to local politics?
Well, the sharpest answer, how many people are watching here tonight who haven't yet signed up to be a candidate? That'll tell you how many extra we would like. We stood 619 in 2015. That was a high point. We'd had 5 years to develop. We then recalibrated because Jeremy got elected leader, as I explained earlier on. We've probably only had about 5 months this time with the relaunch. I would be extremely pleased if we got to about half that number on this first time out. In absolute terms, we have 103 that were approved a couple of weeks ago at a meeting that Chris and I were at. I suspect there is already in train at least that same number again. And we've got 10 or a dozen more launch meetings that are up on our website, tusk.org.uk, under the events page, in all sorts of parts of the country that Chris is speaking at a number of them in the next 2 weeks. So we may go beyond that. 200 to 300 may be possible. But if everybody who's listening tonight would like to find out more, we have an application form on the website. We have the policies, which are the base that we ask everybody to accept when they sign up. And we have a comprehensive guide for candidates and agents that explains all the technical bits that you need to know about in standing as a candidate. It's better if you stand as part of an organisation, bringing along people from your community, from your union, from another group, a political party, but people can stand, as we have already, some independents who are standing, but they're standing as socialist independents. See, the trouble is, if you stand as an independent in the British electoral system, you're probably thought of as a disgruntled Tory, because that's where in the rural areas most independents seem to be. People can't get on with the hierarchy of the Tory party. You need to have a label. And the advantage of Tusk is that our label that goes on the ballot paper opposes cuts. So if anybody comes in and not quite sure who or what you are, they can see you're an anti-cuts party. And that's an important bit of information to get out. So I don't know the exact number. It's 103 as of a fortnight ago. I suspect it'll be at least double that, hopefully more. I would welcome any individual trade unionist, community campaigner or socialist who's either a member of a local group or a political party or an independent who thinks they'd like to stand for Tusk, and have a look on the website and get in touch with us. We'd like to have as many candidates as we possibly can.
Sean, we've got time for one more brief question and then we'll call it a night.
Yeah, that's fine. I was just coming to my final one anyway. Just on that point, Dave, how can we find out where Tusk will be standing their candidates? Because I'm sure there's a lot of our members throughout the country now who will be wanting to help get out the campaign for them.
That'd be great. And we also hope quite a few would like to stand as well, because that would broaden our appeal. And we'd appreciate that. It's the website. If you go to www.tusk.org.uk, I'd have to say about Tusk, by the way, when we started it 10 years ago, if you'd gone onto Google and put in the words Tusk, you'd have come up with the Taunton Ukulele Strummers Club. Well, we've now exceeded the ukulele strummers in Taunton, and we do come up top of your Google search lists. And on there, we've just announced yesterday, we've printed all the areas and the names of the candidates for all the challenges. So there are 3 regional lists I think it's Central, East and West from memory, in Wales for the Senate elections. Separately, there will be candidates in Scotland. In the English councils, there are, I think, 39 councils so far where we've got at least a candidate, and some we've got multiples. Last Wednesday, not on that list yet, but last Wednesday in Plymouth, there were 14 candidates selected at their launch meeting in Plymouth. We've got, I think, one candidate so far in the GLA Assembly elections, but I think there's more to come there. So you can see there's a printed list of the first 103. The closing date for applications is March the 14th. So that's only 10 days away. But the form itself to apply isn't a particularly onerous one. And after that, there is still time up to, I think, April the 8th for your application to be made legally and locally to the elections manager or the returning officer of the local council. So go on the website, you'll see those who've been selected so far. You'll see that they're from a wide range of unions. The most so far, we've got about 30, nearly 40 candidates from Unite. I think we've got about 25 from Unison, a whole range of different unions. You'll see the areas, you'll see the councils, and if there's a gap, why not stand yourself? As Mahatma Gandhi once said, be the change you want to see in the world.
Absolutely. Look, thanks very much. Thank you, Sean, and thank you, everybody, for watching this evening. Particular thanks to Dave Nellist. Really interesting discussion. Hopefully it's inspired people to get involved and maybe even stand for election in these upcoming council elections in May. Thank you for watching this evening. Next week, we're going to be discussing local government. We touched on that a little bit this evening, but what can we actually achieve in local government? And that will be something we'll be examining next week. So please join us then, same time, same place, 7 o'clock on Wednesday. Look forward to seeing you then. Thanks for watching and good night.
Thank you.